In the basement of a Georgia plantation in 1864, 23 children were discovered, locked away. All of them bore the same distinctive features: high cheekbones, pale green eyes, and auburn hair streaked with gold. Huddled together in darkness, these children were found by Union soldiers who forced open the iron doors of the Thornhill estate in Burke County. Some were as young as 4, while others were approaching adolescence. What the eldest, a girl of 13, told the officers was something that made veteran soldiers physically ill. "Mistress says we are her legacy. We cannot leave because we are her blood." Only once in a letter marked confidential is the incident mentioned in military records from the 34th Massachusetts Infantry, a document buried in regimental archives for over a century. As if the plantation and its mistress never existed, local histories of Burke County omit Thornhill Estate entirely. But they did exist. And in those 16 years between her husband's death and the arrival of federal troops, what Catherine Thornhill created represents one of the most disturbing chapters in American history. Designed to create generations of enslaved people who could never escape their bondage, it was a systematic breeding program, because they were genetically tied to their owner. Before we continue with the story of Catherine Thornhill and the nightmare she built in rural Georgia, I need you to do something. If this story is making your skin crawl, hit that subscribe button right now. Into the darkest corners of American history is where this channel dives deep. The stories they don't teach in schools, the secrets buried in courthouse basements and forgotten military records, this is what we uncover. And I want to know where you're listening from. Drop a comment and tell me what state or city you're in. Are you close to Burke County, Georgia? Does your own town have secrets like this buried in its past? Let's find out together. Now, let's go back to where it all began. To a cold February morning in 1847, when a young widow inherited a dying plantation and conceived a plan that would haunt Georgia for generations. The coldest Burke County had seen in 20 years was the winter Catherine Danforth Thornhill buried her husband. On 1,700 acres of red clay soil, 7 miles southwest of Woodsboro, the county seat, sat the Thornhill estate. Cotton country was what Burke County was in 1847, though not as prosperous as the Black Belt regions further west. Tired from decades of single-crop farming, the soil here was overworked. By the 1840s, plantations that had flourished in the 1820s were struggling, squeezed between falling cotton prices and rising costs. Laborers had been drawn away by the Mexican War, and talk of territorial expansion divided communities along bitter lines. Among the more successful properties in the region, Thornhill Estate had once been. From his father in 1838, Jonathan Thornhill, Catherine's late husband, had inherited it with 42 enslaved workers, adequate equipment, and manageable debt. But a poor manager and an enthusiastic gambler was what Jonathan had been. To the hilt, the estate was mortgaged by the time a winter fever claimed him in February 1847. The fields were producing barely enough to feed the workers, and like buzzards, creditors were circling. 28 was how old Catherine was when she became a widow. When she was 19, she had married Jonathan, a strategic match arranged by her father, Theodore Danforth, a prominent merchant in Augusta. Old Georgia money were the Danforths, descended from settlers who had arrived in the 1730s. By private tutors, Catherine had been educated, she spoke French passably well, and with expectations of managing a substantial household, she had been raised. What she had not expected was to inherit a failing plantation with crushing debts and a 16-year-old son who looked at her with something approaching hatred. From his first marriage, Richard Thornhill was Jonathan's son. Giving birth to him in 1831, his mother had died, and 5 years later, Jonathan had remarried. An interloper who had replaced his real mother, Richard had never warmed to Catherine, viewing her. A sullen, bookish boy, he was who spent most of his time in the estate's small library, avoiding both his stepmother and the practical work of running a plantation. Weak, impractical, and entirely too sentimental about the enslaved workers was how Catherine found him. That they should be taught to read he had once suggested, an idea so dangerous that Catherine had forbidden him from speaking of it again. Its declining fortunes were reflected in the plantation itself. A two-story structure of whitewashed brick with 6 columns across the front portico, the main house was built in 1805 in the Federal style. From the window frames, paint peeled and the roof leaked in 3 places. A mix of inherited pieces from Jonathan's family and cheaper replacements purchased when the good pieces had been sold to pay gambling debts was the furniture inside. In similar states of disrepair, behind the main house stood the kitchen building, the smokehouse, the dairy, and the overseer's cottage. Further back, beyond a line of live oaks draped with Spanish moss, were the quarters where the enslaved population lived. On the property, 31 people remained in 1847. 11 men, 13 women, and 7 children. Over the previous 3 years, 16 others had been sold off to satisfy Jonathan's creditors. That more sales were coming was known by those who remained. Like fog over the Savannah River, fear hung over the quarters. In a kind of controlled fury, Catherine spent the first month after Jonathan's death. She met with the estate's lawyer, Ambrose Talbot, who laid out her options in blunt terms. Sell the property and the remaining workers to settle the debts and perhaps have enough left over to live modestly in Augusta under her father's roof, or find some way to make the plantation profitable again, which Talbot considered unlikely given the state of the cotton market and the estate's depleted resources. To Catherine, neither option was acceptable. Returning to Augusta would mean admitting failure, living as a dependent spinster in her father's house, forever marked as the widow who couldn't hold on to her inheritance. But she also recognized that traditional plantation management wouldn't save Thornhill Estate. The land was worn out. The equipment was old. Insufficient in number to work the cotton fields profitably were the remaining enslaved workers, and she had no money to purchase more. Poring over the estate's account books by candlelight during one of these sleepless nights was when Catherine conceived her plan. With the cold logic of desperation, the idea came to her. If she couldn't afford to purchase workers, she would breed them, but not in the haphazard way most plantations did it, offering minor incentives for couples to have children and waiting 15 years for those children to become productive laborers. No, something far more systematic, more controlled was what Catherine envisioned. A population of workers who were biologically tied to the estate, who could never be sold because they were her own descendants, who would have an instinctive loyalty to the plantation because it was literally in their blood. This is what she would create. Monstrous was the plan. But to Catherine, it was also elegant. To bear children, she was still young enough. From among the enslaved population, she would select the strongest, healthiest men and conceive children with them. Knowing their parentage, these children would be raised, would be given slightly better treatment than the others to ensure their loyalty, and when they reached maturity, would be paired with enslaved women to produce the next generation. A workforce of 50 or more, all bound to Thornhill Estate by ties that went deeper than legal ownership, within 20 years, Catherine calculated she could have. She began keeping a journal to work out the details. Of personal feelings, this was no diary. For that, Catherine was far too practical. Instead, what she called her cultivation records was what she created, filled with calculations, observations, and plans. In a simple substitution cipher, she wrote, replacing key words with innocuous agricultural terms. Seedlings became children. Rootstock became the men she selected. Plantings were pregnancies. For livestock, the journal's pages were covered with diagrams that looked like breeding charts because that was essentially what they were. A man named Isaac, 24 years old, born on the plantation and known for his physical strength and steady temperament, was Catherine's first selection. To the main house on a March evening in 1847, she summoned him after the other workers had retired to the quarters. In Catherine's journal only as, first planting completed with rootstock 1, weather clear and mild, was what happened that night recorded. She summoned him again 3 weeks later and then twice more before the month ended. That she was pregnant, by April, Catherine was confident. With the same emotional detachment she might note the planting of cotton, she recorded this in her journal. Initial cultivation successful. Anticipate harvest in December. In late May of 1847, Richard Thornhill first suspected something was wrong with his stepmother. That she had stopped taking her morning rides around the property, claiming the heat bothered her, he noticed, even though the Georgia summer had barely begun. More frequently, she took her meals in her room, and had dismissed the house servant who usually attended her, preferring to manage her own affairs. For a woman as concerned with appearances as Catherine, this withdrawal was unusual. But a conversation Richard overheard in early June was what truly alarmed him. Hidden behind one of the tall bookcases, he had been in the library when Catherine met with Miriam Grayson in the adjacent parlor. The local midwife was Mrs. Grayson, a sharp-featured woman of 50 who attended births for both white and enslaved families throughout Burke County. Slightly, Richard knew her. As a skilled practitioner, she had a reputation, but also as someone who asked few questions and kept confidences. Absolutely. You're certain of your condition, Mrs. Grayson? Asked in her clipped professional tone. Quite certain, Catherine replied. Sometime in early December, I should think. And in February, Mr. Thornhill passed, you said. There was a pause. Hardly breathing, Richard pressed himself against the bookcase. My late husband and I were intimate in January, Catherine said evenly. Shortly before his final illness. Of course, Mrs. Grayson's voice carried a note of something, not quite disbelief, but a careful neutrality. To examine you properly, I'll need, and we should discuss the arrangements for the delivery. Here at the house, will you want me? I will, and I'll need your discretion, Miriam. Absolutely. You have it, as always. Until both women had left the room, Richard waited before emerging from his hiding place. His hands were shaking. The mathematics didn't work. For the entire month of January, his father had been bedridden, barely conscious most days, racked with fever and chills. Many nights, Richard had sat with him. Between his father and Catherine, there had been no possibility of intimate relations, which meant the child Catherine was carrying had been conceived after Jonathan's death in March or April with someone else. Sick to his stomach made the implications Richard. If word got out that Catherine had conceived a child out of wedlock, the scandal would destroy what little remained of the family's reputation. To seize the property, creditors would move immediately. The Danforth family in Augusta would disown. But beyond the practical consequences, by the deception itself, Richard was appalled. As his father's legitimate heir, Catherine intended to claim this child, to lie to everyone, to build her future on a foundation of fraud. He considered his options. Directly, he could confront Catherine, but he was only 16, and she held all legal authority over the estate. In Westboro, he could go to lawyer Talbot. But without proof, it would be his word against Catherine's, and as a minor, his testimony would carry little weight. In Augusta, he could write to his grandfather Danforth. But from the estate, Catherine read all outgoing mail. Instead, carefully, Richard began to watch Catherine, looking for evidence, trying to understand what she was planning. Regularly, he noticed that she summoned Isaac to the main house, always after dark, always when the overseer was away in town or occupied with duties elsewhere on the property. How Catherine's manner toward Isaac was different from her treatment of other enslaved workers, he saw, not kind exactly, but less overtly hostile. In full sentences rather than curt commands, she spoke to him. That Isaac was the father of Catherine's child, by July, Richard was certain. With horror, the realization filled him, not just at the violation of social and legal boundaries, but at what it revealed about Catherine's character. With an enslaved man, she had coldly, deliberately chosen to conceive a child, to claim that child as her late husband's, and to maintain this lie indefinitely. Of such calculated deception, what kind of woman was capable? In early August, during one of Catherine's rare trips to Westboro, he found part of the answer. For legal documents related to the estate, Richard had been searching. Of finding something that might give him leverage over Catherine, he had vague thoughts when he discovered a leather-bound journal hidden in a locked drawer of Catherine's writing desk. For a determined 16-year-old to pick, the lock was simple enough. In cipher, the journal was written, but Richard had always been good with puzzles. Whenever Catherine was out of the house, it took him 3 days, working in secret to crack the basic substitution pattern. What he read made his blood run cold. With Isaac, Catherine wasn't just having an affair. A deliberate breeding program she was implementing. In chilling detail, the journal laid it out. Her plan to conceive multiple children with selected enslaved men, to raise those children as part of the plantation workforce, and eventually to breed those children with each other and with other enslaved people to create an ever-expanding population of workers who would be genetically tied to Thornhill Estate and to Catherine herself. There were charts. Calculations of expected births over 5-year periods, notes on which men displayed desirable physical characteristics, speculation about whether traits like strength, intelligence, and temperament were heritable. From a livestock breeder's manual, it read like something, except the livestock were human beings. Several pages of the journal, Richard copied, translating the cipher into plain English, his hand shaking so badly he could barely hold the pen. This was evidence. Of Catherine's depravity, this was proof. To the authorities, he could take this. He could expose. But at dinner that night, Catherine looked at him with those cold green eyes and said casually, "Richard, have you been in my study recently? Some of my papers seem to have been disturbed." "No, ma'am," Richard lied, his throat tight. "Away for good reason, I keep certain documents locked," Catherine continued, cutting her meat with precise strokes. "If I ever found that someone had violated my privacy, broken my trust in such a fundamental way, I'm afraid I would have to take serious action. Do you understand?" "Yes, ma'am." "Good. Because everything is family loyalty, Richard. Everything. Without it, we're simply animals tearing at each other." She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Very much. I know you loved your father. By scandal, I would hate for his memory to be tarnished, especially scandal that might emerge from within his own household." The threat was clear. If Richard tried to expose Catherine, she would find a way to turn it back on him, to paint him as a disturbed, resentful stepson inventing lies about a grieving widow. Who would people believe? A respected plantation mistress from a prominent family or an awkward teenage boy with known resentment toward his stepmother? That night, Richard returned to his room and burned the pages he had copied, but he kept watching Catherine, and he began to feel increasingly unwell. With fatigue, it started. By mid-afternoon, by September, Richard found himself exhausted, unable to focus on his books. His appetite diminished. That made it difficult to think clearly. He developed frequent headaches, muscle weakness and occasional stomach pains. By October, he was experiencing great concern, Catherine showed. In bed, she insisted Richard stay. Herself, she prepared his meals, bringing him bowls of soup and plates of soft foods. To examine him, she summoned Mrs. Grayson. In the absence of a proper physician, the midwife, who also served as a general medical practitioner, diagnosed nervous exhaustion complicated by possible consumption. When Richard felt strong enough, she prescribed rest, fresh air, and a special tonic that Catherine obtained from a pharmacy in Augusta. Of sensitive disposition, tuberculosis often strikes young men, Catherine told Richard, adjusting his pillows with attentive care. "At just your age, your father had a cousin who died of it. We must be very vigilant." Better, Richard knew. During his hours in the library, he had read about arsenic poisoning. In himself, he recognized the symptoms, the fatigue, the digestive troubles, the muscle weakness. As disease, Catherine was slowly killing him, disguising murder, eliminating the one person who knew her secret and posed a threat to her plans. To fight back, but he was too weak, too isolated to get help. Absolutely, the house servants followed Catherine's orders. Rarely, the overseer came to the main house. On the second floor, Richard's room was, and by November, to get out of bed, he barely had the strength, let alone escape the property and reach Westboro. One final attempt to expose Catherine in late November, he made, writing a letter to his grandfather, Danforth, in Augusta. To compose it, it took him 3 days, working for a few minutes at a time before exhaustion overwhelmed him. Her breeding program, her journal, the poisoning, he described. And gave it to one of the younger house servants, a girl named Pearl. He sealed the letter, begging her to post it in Westboro without telling Catherine. The letter, Pearl took, but she also told Catherine, terrified of what would happen if the mistress discovered she'd been keeping secrets. Expressionless, Catherine read the letter, then burned it in the fireplace in front of Richard. "Very ill, your darling," she said softly, almost tenderly. "Your mind is affecting the fever. That aren't real, you're imagining things. That you won't have to suffer much longer, it's a mercy really." On December 3, 1847, Richard Thornhill died, 3 weeks before his 17th birthday. From Westboro, Dr. Samuel Pritchard, summoned to record the death, noted consumption as the cause, and remarked that the young man had wasted away with tragic speed. Decorously, Catherine wept at the funeral. For a full year, she wore black. After Richard's burial, for days, Catherine gave birth to a healthy son. After her late husband, she named him Jonathan and claimed he had been born slightly premature, which explained any questions about timing. From Catherine's widowhood, few people in Burke County thought to count backwards to the birth. To themselves, those who did kept their speculations. Openly, not the kind of thing one discussed, was it? In ways that seemed almost miraculous to outside observers, the years between 1848 and 1856 transformed Thornhill Estate. Slowly regained its footing, the plantation that had teetered on the edge of bankruptcy. Cotton production increased. The enslaved workforce grew. As a shrewd, if somewhat reclusive, plantation mistress who managed her property with uncommon efficiency, Catherine Thornhill earned a reputation. But at a terrible cost that no outsider ever saw, that efficiency came. For more times between 1848 and 1853, Catherine gave birth. Daughters named Elalina, Abigail, and Margaret, and another son she called Samuel. By Miriam Grayson, who by now was deeply complicit in Catherine's schemes, each birth was attended only. For her services and her silence, the midwife received generous payment, regular fees that far exceeded her normal rates, plus a small cottage on the edge of the Thornhill property where she could live without paying rent. Far beyond delivering Catherine's children, Mrs. Grayson's role extended. A darker function, she also performed, ensuring that enslaved women on the property only gave birth to children who fit Catherine's careful plans. Outside Catherine's controlled pairings, when pregnancies occurred, and they did, because human beings will form attachments and intimate relationships, even in the most oppressive circumstances, plant-based compounds that induced miscarriages, Mrs. Grayson provided abortifacients. In a small room behind the overseer's cottage, away from the main house, away from witnesses, she performed these procedures. Even to each other, the women subjected to these forced abortions rarely spoke of them. Profound was the trauma, the grief unvoiceable in a system that already denied them autonomy over their own bodies. Through the quarters anyway, whispers circulated. Of women who had been pregnant 1 week and bleeding the next, stories, who were told they had simply lost the babies naturally, though everyone knew Mrs. Grayson had been involved. One woman named Ruth tried to resist. Pregnant, she was 5 months in the spring of 1851 when Catherine discovered that the father was not the man Catherine had designated for her, but instead a young field hand named Samuel, with whom Ruth had formed a genuine attachment. Immediately, Catherine ordered Mrs. Grayson to terminate the pregnancy. Ruth ran into the pine forests southwest of the plantation. She made it nearly 4 miles before the overseer's dogs tracked her down. To Thornhill Estate, she was dragged back, held down by 2 men while Mrs. Grayson forcibly administered the abortifacient compounds. Physically, Ruth survived the ordeal, but something fundamental broke inside her. Mechanically after that, she worked, spoke rarely, and died 2 years later during a fever outbreak that swept through the quarters. 24 years old, she was. But among many, just one tragedy was Ruth's. 7 children of her own, by 1856, Catherine's program had produced, all of whom were being raised in a peculiar liminal space. Legally enslaved, they were. In the county records, Catherine had registered them as such, claiming them as children born to enslaved women on the property, which gave her legal ownership of them, but in practice they lived in the main house, wore decent clothes, ate better food than the other enslaved children, and received informal education from Catherine herself. In 1856, young Jonathan, the eldest, was 8 years old. A serious, quiet child, he was who resembled Catherine strongly. The same green eyes, the same auburn hair, the same sharp features. Of his father, Isaac, who had been sold to a plantation in Alabama in 1849, he had no memory. A complication once his purpose had been served, Catherine had found Isaac's presence. Of the estate's remaining debts, the money from his sale helped pay down some. Nothing of their true parentage, the younger children knew. Whom she had taken into her household out of Christian charity, Catherine told them they were fortunate orphans. To read and write, she taught them, a dangerous illegality in Georgia, where teaching enslaved people literacy was prohibited by law. But confident no one from the outside would ever enter her home and discover what she was teaching these children, Catherine was. For the next phase of her plan, she was grooming them, preparing them. But patience, that phase required. Before they could be used for breeding, the children needed to reach physical maturity. Her meticulous record-keeping, Catherine continued, tracking their growth, their health, their temperaments. Which children showed physical strength, which seemed more intelligent, which were more compliant, she noted. Decades in advance, she was planning pairings. Of her own, she continued having children in the meantime. Between 1854 and 1856, 3 more were born. Sons named William and Henry and a daughter called Caroline. From among the enslaved men on the property, each had a different father carefully selected. Ruthlessly practical were Catherine's criteria. Physical health, strength, decent teeth, good eyesight, no obvious impairments. For their personalities or characters, she cared nothing. In her mind, simply genetic material to be utilized, they were. In the matter, the men themselves had no choice. To the main house, when Catherine summoned them, they came, knowing that refusal would mean brutal punishment or sale. What was happening, that the children Catherine bore would be their own biological offspring, some of them understood, even as those children would be raised to think of Catherine as their benefactors and savior. Extreme was the psychological torture of this situation. To children they could never acknowledge, never parent, never protect, they were forced to become fathers. One man named Thomas was summoned to the main house in 1855. 26 years old, he was married to a woman named Hannah, who lived in the quarters. With their first child, Hannah was pregnant. For breeding, when Thomas learned that Catherine intended to use him, he tried to refuse. A brutal man named Virgil Kane, the overseer, had Thomas whipped in front of the assembled enslaved population. For life, 39 lashes that left his back scarred. To the main house anyway, then Catherine had him brought. He complied, Thomas. He had no other choice. But to Hannah about what happened in the main house, he never spoke, and Hannah never asked. To voice, some knowledge was too poisonous. Along Catherine's twisted logic, by 1856, Thornhill Estate housed a population that looked normal on the surface, but was actually structured. Who worked the cotton and corn under the overseer's supervision? There were the field workers, about 20 adults and their children. Who cooked, cleaned, and maintained the domestic space? There were the house servants, 3 women and 1 elderly man. And then there were Catherine's special children, 10 in total by 1856, ranging in age from 8 years old down to infancy. In the plantation hierarchy, these children occupied a strange position. For their privileges, the other enslaved people resented them, but also pitied them for what they represented. On some level, what Catherine was doing, everyone in the quarters understood. For eugenics or breeding programs, they didn't have language. Those terms would come later, but they recognized the pattern. How Catherine kept detailed records of the children, how she measured them periodically, how she noted their development in her locked journal, they saw, and with a kind of horrified anticipation for what would happen when these children grew up, they waited. What Catherine intended, because everyone knew. She had, in subtle ways, in comments and instructions, made it clear. To produce the next generation of workers, these children were being raised. In Catherine's long-term plan to create a workforce that could never leave, could never be sold because they were genetically bound to her and to Thornhill Estate, they were tools. Disguised as innovation, it was an abomination. But in the isolated world of a rural Georgia plantation in the 1850s, with no outside oversight and absolute power concentrated in the hands of the property owner, Catherine was able to pursue her vision without interference. In Westboro, the only person who posed any potential threat was lawyer Talbot, who handled the estate's legal affairs and thus had access to records that might raise questions. But a practical man who valued profitable clients was Talbot. And profitable was becoming Thornhill Estate by 1856. The cotton yields were improving. At no acquisition cost, the workforce was growing through Catherine's breeding program. Debts were being paid down. Because he benefited from Catherine's success, Talbot asked no uncomfortable questions. The isolation of the plantation helped maintain secrecy. From Westboro, Thornhill Estate was 7 miles, connected by a rough road that was often impassable in winter. Few were neighbors. Away, the nearest plantation was 3 miles. Rarely, Catherine entertained visitors and discouraged social calls. Usually at church on Sundays or at occasional gatherings in Westboro, when she did interact with other plantation families, she presented herself as a proper widow, managing her late husband's property with Christian virtue and practical wisdom. Behind the whitewashed brick walls of the main house and in the quarters beyond the oak trees, no one suspected the systematic horror occurring. And even if they had suspected, would they have cared? In the 1850s, this was Georgia, a society built on the brutal exploitation of enslaved labor. More systematic, more coldly calculated than most, Catherine's program was, but it was not fundamentally different in kind from what happened on thousands of other plantations across the South. Of the entire situation, that was perhaps the most disturbing aspect. Monstrous was Catherine's breeding program, but it was also logical within the framework of a society that already treated human beings as property to be bought, sold, and bred at will. The underlying logic of slavery and followed it to one of its most horrifying conclusions, she had simply taken. But on such profound injustice, systems built contain the seeds of their own destruction. To Georgia and the entire South, change was coming, though in 1856, how soon or how violently it would arrive, few people could imagine. To Burke County and all of Georgia, the late 1850s brought increasing tensions. The question of slavery's expansion into new territories dominated national politics. In anxious tones at the courthouse in Westboro, the violence in Kansas Territory where pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers were literally killing each other was discussed. In office, the presidential election of 1856, which put James Buchanan, did little to resolve the fundamental conflicts tearing the country apart. To politics, Catherine paid little attention. On Thornhill Estate and her long-term program, her focus remained fixed. Adolescence, by 1859, her eldest children were approaching. Jonathan was 11, Elalina was 10, Abigail was 9. For the breeding phase of Catherine's plan, they were still too young, but she was already making preparations, already selecting which of the enslaved young women would be appropriate partners when the time came. In a previously unused section of the mansion's east wing, it was during this period that Catherine constructed what she called the Heritage Room. For family records and memorabilia, she told the house servants it would be a storage space. To her breeding program, in reality, it was a shrine. Lit by oil lamps with walls lined with shelves and a large table in the center, the room was windowless. Her coded journals, on the shelves, Catherine stored. By 1859, 3 leather-bound volumes, chronicling every birth, every pairing, every observation about the children's development. She also kept small glass vials, each labeled with a name and a date containing locks of hair from each child. By generation and parentage, these samples were arranged in rows organized, a physical archive of her genetic experiments. In ink, on the table, Catherine had drawn elaborate family trees, showing not actual family relationships, but her planned pairings for future generations. With notations about anticipated outcomes, lines connected names. Strong constitution, good teeth, intelligent, compliant temperament. For show dogs or racehorses, it looked like breeding charts, except the names were human. Abigail paired with Thomas's son, Jacob. Eleanor with Isaac's son, Marcus, who would be born in 1862. Margaret with Samuel's nephew, Peter. In this room, Catherine spent hours, planning decades into the future, imagining a Thornhill estate populated by 100 or more workers, all descended from her, all genetically and psychologically bound to the land. Something revolutionary, in her mind, she was creating. A plantation that would never face labor shortages, never require expensive purchases of new workers, never risk mass escapes because the enslaved population would have nowhere else to go. This was what she was creating. In the most literal sense, they were family. Even tighter control over the plantation's social structures, the practical implementation of this vision required Catherine to exert. Based on their roles in her program, she began separating the children into different groups. In or near the main house, the special children, her own biological offspring, continued living. At a distance, the other enslaved children were kept, sleeping in the quarters, working in the fields as soon as they were old enough. But these other children, too, Catherine needed. For the genetic mixing she envisioned, they were necessary. So, a system of subtle manipulation, she implemented. To families who cooperated with their pairings, offering small privileges, threatening separation and sale to those who resisted. Immense and constant was the psychological pressure. In an impossible position, a woman named Violet, mother of 3, found herself. In 1860, Catherine had decided that Violet's eldest daughter, a girl of 14 named Sarah, should be paired with one of the older field hands, a man in his 30s named Elijah. A child, and Elijah was old enough to be her father. Sarah was terrified she was still. To wait, to give Sarah more time, Violet begged Catherine. Cold was Catherine's response. 2 younger daughters, you have, Violet. To settle this matter, would you prefer I sell them? Or to this estate and to you, will Sarah do her duty? That autumn, Sarah was paired with Elijah. From complications of the delivery, she gave birth to a daughter 9 months later and died. 15 years old, she was. From the loss, Violet never recovered. Mechanically, she continued working, speaking to no one, and in 1862, she walked into the Savannah River and drowned herself. But to outside observers, tragedies like Sarah and Violet's were invisible. Which was rare. When visitors came to Thornhill Estate, they saw a well-managed plantation with neat fields, a substantial house, and a workforce that appeared adequately fed and housed. In the quarters, the horror was carefully hidden, buried, locked in the heritage room, encoded in Catherine's journals. Then came 1860, and everything changed. Abraham Lincoln was elected president. From the Union in December, South Carolina seceded. In January 1861, Georgia followed with delegates at the secession convention in Milledgeville voting 208 to 89 to leave the United States and join the Confederate States of America. With the firing on Fort Sumter, war came in April. A short conflict, a few months, perhaps a year, and the Confederacy would establish its independence. Initially, many Georgians believed it would be. But through 1861 into 1862 through 1863, the war dragged on. To fight in Virginia and Tennessee, young men from Burke County marched off. In coffins, some returned. At all, others didn't return. In ways she hadn't anticipated, the war disrupted Catherine's plans. In the Confederate Army in 1861, the overseer, Virgil Kane, enlisted and was killed at Shiloh in April 1862. Difficult was finding a replacement. At war, most able-bodied white men were away. An elderly man named Silas Kendrick, who was too old for military service, Catherine eventually hired. Than Cain had been, Kendrick was less brutal, but he was also less effective at maintaining discipline and control. The shifting power dynamics, the enslaved population at Thornhill Estate began to sense. That connected plantations across Georgia, news filtered through the slave networks. Whispered reports of Union victories, rumors that Lincoln had issued a proclamation freeing enslaved people in Confederate territory, speculation about what would happen if the Yankees came south. As best she could, Catherine tightened her control. To the plantation, she confined the enslaved population, forbidding anyone from leaving, even to visit relatives on neighboring properties. To reduce the temptation to run away, she increased rations slightly. And she accelerated her breeding program, pushing some of the children into pairings earlier than she had originally planned. In December 1862, Jonathan, her eldest son, turned 15. He was ready, Catherine decided. A young woman named Rachel, 16 years old, the daughter of one of the field hands, she had selected. In the matter, Rachel had no say. In the main house, in February 1863, Catherine arranged for Jonathan and Rachel to be married in a ceremony she conducted herself, a mockery of a wedding with no legal standing, designed purely to give a veneer of respectability to the breeding pairing. In isolation from the other enslaved people, Jonathan, who had been raised and taught to think of Catherine as his benefactors, accepted this arrangement without question. Of what had been done to him, he had no understanding, no awareness that Catherine was his biological mother, no sense of the profound wrongness of the entire situation. Into silence, Rachel, traumatized, said nothing. But in the quarters, others were watching. The ones she'd raised in the main house, they saw Catherine pairing these special children with the other enslaved young people. Whatever Catherine had been planning all these years, this was the next phase of, they understood. And in the quarters, a quiet, desperate rage began building. Until circumstances finally shifted in their favor, a rage that would have nowhere to go. To Burke County, the spring of 1863 brought terrible news. Confederate losses were mounting. After the fall of Vicksburg, the Union Army controlled the Mississippi River. In disaster at Gettysburg, in July, Lee's invasion of Pennsylvania ended. Of food, cloth, and basic supplies made life increasingly difficult, even for white plantation families, shortages. Harsher still, for the enslaved population, conditions became as Catherine rationed everything more severely. But at Thornhill Estate, something else was happening, something Catherine tried desperately to hide from the outside world. Of their true parentage, the children she had been breeding and raising were becoming aware. With Elalina, Catherine's second-born daughter, now 14 years old, it began. Of Catherine's children, the most observant, she had always been, the one who asked uncomfortable questions. In May 1863, while helping Catherine organize papers in the study, Eleanor discovered one of the coded journals that Catherine had carelessly left unlocked. From Catherine herself, Elalina had learned to read. Intelligent, curious, and bored with the limited reading material available in the house, she was. The journal's cipher intrigued. In secret, she spent 3 weeks working on it, the same way Richard had done 16 years earlier, slowly decoding the substitution pattern. Of her entire existence, what she found destroyed her understanding. Her conception, the journal detailed. Second planting with rootstock 2. Thomas age 21. Excellent physical specimen. Strong back. Good teeth. Weather warm and humid. Anticipate harvest in late October 1848. Again and again, Elalina read the entry, her hands shaking. Rootstock 2. Thomas. She knew Thomas. One of the field hands, he was. A quiet man in his 30s who never made eye contact with anyone. Her father, he was. Her mother, Catherine was. Out of charity, she was not an orphan raised. Of Catherine's deliberate breeding experiment, she was the product. Through Elalina's mind, the implications cascaded. For her, if this was true, it was true for Jonathan, for Abigail, for all the children Catherine had brought into the main house. With enslaved men, Catherine's biological children, conceived, they were, and their entire lives, they had been lied to. For their futures, worse still, the journal laid out Catherine's plans. About pairings, about anticipated offspring, about the creation of a self-sustaining workforce, Eleanor read the notations. In one of the charts, she saw her own name connected by a line to someone called Marcus Isaac's son to be born 1862. Pairing with Eleanor anticipated 1865. Physically sick, Eleanor felt. With a boy who hadn't even been born yet, Catherine intended to pair her, to force her to have children who would be enslaved on this plantation forever, to turn her into another breeding tool in this nightmare system. That night, she confronted Catherine, her voice shaking with rage and horror. "Your journal," I read. "What you are, I know. What I am, I know." Still, Catherine's face went, her eyes cold as winter. "That, you should not have done, Eleanor. My mother, my father, Thomas is, and to breed us like animals, you've been planning." Barely, Eleanor could force the words out. "Sit down," Catherine commanded. "No. Sit down." Unmistakable, the threat in Catherine's voice was. Her whole body trembling, Eleanor sat. Through the problem Eleanor now represented, Catherine paced the room, her mind clearly working. Finally, she spoke. "The position we're in, you are intelligent enough to understand. So, plainly, I'll speak. Yes, your biological mother, I am. Yes, a systematic program to create a self-sustaining workforce for this estate, I have been implementing. And yes, when you come of age, you and the others will participate in that program." "I won't," Eleanor said, but her voice lacked conviction. "You will, because far worse is the alternative." Forward, Catherine leaned, her face inches from Eleanor's. "In this house, right now, you live. Good food, you eat. Decent clothes, you wear. And right, you can read and. If you refuse to cooperate, what do you think happens? I sell. To a plantation in Alabama or Mississippi where they work field hands to death in 5 years, I sell you. As a matter of course, where women are brutalized. A whipping or worse, where literacy earns you. Is that what you want?" "Nothing," Eleanor said. Down her face, tears streaming. "I thought not." Straightened, Catherine. "To your brothers or sisters, you will not speak of this. To anyone in the quarters, you will not speak of it. As before, you will continue your life exactly. And when the time comes for you to fulfill your role in this family's future, you will do so. Do you understand?" "Yes," Eleanor whispered. But a critical error, Catherine had made. Without adequately controlling the information, she had revealed the truth. To others, Eleanor did speak, not immediately, but gradually, carefully. First, she told Jonathan, showing him the journal entries she had memorized. From Eleanor's, Jonathan's reaction was different. By Catherine, he had been so thoroughly conditioned, so completely isolated from any alternative framework for understanding the world that he struggled to see what was wrong with Catherine's plan. "A better life, she gave us," Jonathan said, confused by Eleanor's anger. "In the fields, we could have been working. Here, instead, we're property, we're, Jonathan. Slaves, we're. Us, our own mother enslaved. Us, she's protecting. Together, she's keeping us. If we were sold, separated, we'd be sent to different places. Together, this way, we stay. At Thornhill, we stay." With horror, Eleanor realized that too successfully indoctrinated, Jonathan had been. Around all of them, he couldn't see the cage Catherine had built. But Abigail, 13 years old and sharp as glass, understood immediately when Eleanor told her. And Margaret, at 12, understood, too. To fully grasp it, the younger children were still too young. But the older ones, they knew now. What they were and what Catherine intended for them, they knew. In the main house, the knowledge changed the atmosphere. Catherine felt. In the air, that shift, the way her children looked at her now. Yes, there was fear, but also something else. Calculation, waiting. Their time, they were biding, and Catherine knew it. Her options, she considered. The older children, she could sell, eliminate the problem, but that would waste years of investment and planning. Enough to break their spirits, she could punish them severely, but physical brutality might damage them in ways that would interfere with the breeding program. Of bearing children, healthy, capable, she needed them. So, a different approach, Catherine chose. Through someone else, she would demonstrate the consequences of disobedience. In August 1863, a young woman named Grace tried to run away from Thornhill Estate. 17, pregnant, and desperate, she was. Against her will, she had been paired with one of the field hands, and she couldn't bear the thought of bringing a child into this system. At night, she ran, heading east toward the Savannah River, hoping to somehow cross into South Carolina, and from there make her way to Union lines. Within 12 hours, she was caught. To a creek 3 miles from the plantation, the dogs tracked her. Back, she was brought, locked in one of the outbuildings. And the next morning, all the enslaved people, including her special children from the main house, Catherine assembled in the yard between the quarters and the mansion. Out, Grace was brought, her hands tied. On the porch of the main house, Catherine stood, her face expressionless. Her responsibilities to this estate and to all of you, this woman attempted to abandon. Here, the family we have built, she attempted to destroy. Severe must be the penalty for such betrayal. What followed was brutal. Publicly, Grace was whipped. 20 lashes administered by the elderly overseer Kendrick, who carried out the punishment with grim reluctance. Watch, Catherine made all the children, including her own biological offspring. Clear was the message. To those who try to leave, this is what happens. But again, Catherine had miscalculated. Into submission, the public punishment didn't terrify the enslaved population. Instead, for them, it clarified something. To maintain her control, Catherine was willing to use extreme violence, which meant she was afraid. And if she was afraid, that meant they had more power than they'd realized. In the weeks that followed, whispers began circulating through the quarters. About waiting for the right moment, whispers. About what would happen when the war ended, because surely it would end and surely the Yankees would come south and surely things would change, whispers. Until then, all they had to do was survive. These whispers, Elalina heard. When Catherine wasn't watching, she began spending time near the quarters, developing relationships with the other enslaved people she had been kept separate from her entire life. Catherine had never told her, she learned things, about her father Thomas, about the other men Catherine had used, about the women who had died or been broken by Catherine's program. In October, one evening, Elalina met with a group of the older enslaved women in the woods beyond the quarters. In the darkness, they sat in a circle, speaking in low voices. With something between pity and respect, a woman named Hope, in her 40s, looked at Elalina. "Your mama. Something special here, she thinks she made. Family, thinks she made. But people who hate her in ways she can't even understand, all she did was make. When the war ends, what happens?" Eleanor asked. "On who wins, depends," Hope replied. "Yankees win. Free, we're. Confederates win. The same or get worse, things stay. But either way, what she'd been doing, your mama can't keep doing. No, too many people. Angry, too many people. Got to break, something. What if we made it break?" Elalina asked. In surprise, the women looked at her. Forward, Hope leaned. "What you saying, child? What if for the war to end, we didn't wait? What if ourselves, we ended this? In the air, the idea hung, dangerous and intoxicating. One of the younger women, Anna, spoke up. You talking about running, taking everyone and running, or fighting? Fighting, Eleanor said. Only Mrs. Catherine and old Mr. Kendrick, theirs. Of us, there are 40 and 20 of them are children. Practically, Hope said. And where are we going to go? Confederates catch runaways. Further south, they kill us or sell us. And you? As one of us or one of them, you think they're going to see you? Because she didn't know the answer, the question stung. Catherine's daughter, she was. In the main house, she had grown up. And right, she could read. Than most of the people in the quarters, her skin was lighter. If things came to violence, would they even accept her? Before Elenina could respond, through the underbrush, they heard footsteps crashing. Into the darkness, everyone scattered, melting. Toward the main house, Elenina ran, her heart pounding, wondering if someone had heard their conversation, if Catherine would find out if everything was about to collapse. But no punishment came. Normally, the next day passed and the day after that it seemed they had escaped detection. But the seed had been planted. For external forces to free them, that they didn't have to passively wait. Themselves, they could act. Through the quarters like a fever, that idea began spreading. The change, Catherine sensed but couldn't identify its source. Her surveillance, she increased had Kendrick patrol the quarters at night, restricted movement even further. With each passing week, the tension at Thornhill Estate grew thicker. On the horizon, it was like watching a storm build. Massing, dark clouds, electricity charging the air, for the lightning to strike, everyone waiting. In March of 1864, the break came, but not in the way anyone expected. Through Burke County, a unit of Confederate cavalry came, requisitioning supplies from plantations, food, horses, cloth, anything useful for the war effort. But to comply, Catherine had no choice. Corn, preserved meat, and 2 of the plantation's best horses, she provided. At dawn, the soldiers stayed only one night, camped in the fields beyond the quarters, and departed. But their presence had consequences. About the war's progress, the soldiers spoke openly, and the news was bad for the Confederacy. Through Georgia, Sherman was pushing. From multiple directions, Union forces were closing in. About the war being lost, about going home, about the impossibility of maintaining the fight much longer, some soldiers spoke fatalistically. Every word, the enslaved population at Thornhill Estate heard. Through the quarters, hope surged. Coming, freedom was. Or weeks, it might be months, but it was coming. A little longer, all they had to do was hold on. This hope and terrified by what it meant for her long-term plans, except Catherine, sensing, decided to act decisively. If the Confederacy fell, if the enslaved population was freed, everything she had built would collapse. Her special children would leave. Her breeding program would end. For nothing, 16 years of work would be. That happen, she couldn't allow. On the night of March 17, 1864, in the main house, Catherine gathered her biological children. Jonathan, Elenina, Abigail, Margaret, Samuel, William, Henry, Caroline, and the 3 youngest who were still infants. In total, 11 children, ranging from 16 years old down to 6 months. Very soon, things are going to change, Catherine told them, her voice calm, but her eyes intense. For us, the war may end badly. The Yankees may come. To take you away from me, to destroy our family, there may be attempts. That happen, I cannot allow. Down her spine, Elenina felt ice slide. What are you planning? Our future, we're going to secure, Catherine said. Tonight. To the heritage room in the East Wing, she led them, the room none of them except Jonathan had ever been allowed to enter. The oil lamps illuminating the shelves of journals, the vials of hair samples, the elaborate family trees drawn on paper and pinned to the walls, Catherine lit. Our legacy, this is, Catherine said. Together, this is what we've built, and from us, no one is going to take it. From a locked cabinet, Catherine withdrew a small wooden box. Several glass bottles containing clear liquid were inside. A medicine called laudanum, this is, she explained. From pain, in small doses, it provides relief. In larger doses, eternal peace, it provides. Gasped Abigail. To poison us, you want. To protect you, I want, Catherine corrected, her voice taking on an edge of desperation. If the Yankees come, if they free the others, where will you go? In white society, you're not white enough to live. In their eyes either, you're not fully black. Outcasts, owned by no one, belonging nowhere, you'll be. Here, staying, together, staying with me, is that better than this? Yes, Eleanor said firmly. Then this, anything is better. Hardened, Catherine's face. To understand, you're too young. Too young, all of you are. But your mother, I am, and for this family, I know what's best. Toward the bottles, she moved, but between her and the others, Jonathan stepped. 16, he was, nearly as tall as Catherine, and something in his face had changed. No, he said quietly. Foolish, don't be, Jonathan. The plan, you understand. Understood, you've always. What you told me, I understood, Jonathan said. But the journals, Eleanor showed me. About us, about Father Isaac, about Father Thomas, about all of them, I read what you wrote. What you did, I know. What you are, I know. Your mother, I am. A monster, you are, Jonathan said, and his voice broke on the word. Her, Catherine slapped, a sharp crack that echoed in the small room. How dare you? After everything I've given you, after everything I've sacrificed. Nothing, you sacrificed, Elenina said, stepping forward to stand beside Jonathan. People, you used. Them, you destroyed. Us, you destroyed. At her children, Catherine looked, seeing them clearly, perhaps for the first time. Against her, they were united. What was happening? Even the younger ones who didn't fully understand sensed the confrontation and stood with their older siblings. Them, she had lost. In that moment, a final desperate decision, Catherine made. If she couldn't keep her children, if they were going to reject her and leave her and destroy everything she had built, then she would at least preserve the record of what she had accomplished. What Catherine Thornhill had created, future generations would know, even if the creation itself had failed. The journals, the charts, the vials of hair samples, she grabbed, clutching them to her chest. Me, you think you can escape? None of this happened, you think you can pretend? These records will survive. Here, what I built, they'll prove. Right, I was, they'll prove. Past her children, she pushed and ran from the room, carrying the physical evidence of her crimes. After her, Jonathan and Elena chased, but faster, Catherine was, driven by manic energy. Through the main house, out the front door, across the yard toward the quarters, she ran. On who you asked, what happened next depended. Slightly differently, multiple testimonies would later conflict, each person remembering the events, shaped by their own trauma and perspective. Carrying her journals and specimens, what is certain is that Catherine reached the quarters. In the darkness, to see the mistress who had tormented them for 16 years running toward them, what is certain is that the enslaved population, roused by the commotion, emerged from their cabins. That this was the moment, what is certain is that someone, maybe Hope, maybe one of the men, maybe several people at once, decided. This was when it ended. That night, Catherine Thornhill disappeared. In the mud outside the quarters, her journals were found scattered. Pages torn and muddy. Smashed, the vials of hair samples were. Burned, the charts were. And simply gone, Catherine herself was. Minutes after their mother found chaos, Jonathan and Eleanor reaching the quarters. Shouting, people running in different directions, where someone had lit a fire to burn Catherine's papers, the acrid smell of smoke. But no, Catherine. Where is she? Jonathan demanded. With an expression he couldn't read, Hope looked at him. Gone. That's all you need to know. Gone, and she ain't coming back. She's. To her, what did you do? What she had coming, Hope said simply. Now, a choice, you got, boy. About your mama, you can raise hell, or that justice got done here tonight and let it rest, you can understand. At Eleanor, Jonathan looked. Pale, his sister's face was, her eyes wide, but she nodded slowly. Let it rest, she whispered. The next morning, missing, Catherine Thornhill was reported. The property, old Mr. Kendrick, the overseer, searched, but found nothing. In Westboro, he reported the disappearance to the sheriff, who came out to investigate, but ultimately concluded that in fear of advancing Union forces, Mrs. Thornhill had likely fled the area, a reasonable assumption given the deteriorating military situation. Of what had happened, no one from the quarters spoke. Nothing, Jonathan and Eleanor and the other children said. That Catherine Thornhill disappeared on the night of March 17, 1864 and was never seen again, the official record simply states. But the truth, everyone at Thornhill Estate knew, even if they never spoke it aloud. That night, Catherine had been killed. Somewhere on the plantation's 1,700 acres, her body had been disposed of, and her children, her biological offspring, her breeding experiments, her legacy, had chosen to let her murderers go unpunished because they understood that their mother had earned her fate. 14 months later, the war ended. In late 1864, General Sherman's army swept through Georgia, though they passed 30 miles north of Burke County and never came directly to Thornhill Estate. In April 1865, the Confederacy collapsed. Through a combination of military occupation, the 13th Amendment, and the simple fact that the system of bondage could no longer be maintained, freedom came to the enslaved population of Georgia. At Thornhill Estate, complicated was the transition. As Catherine's eldest child, Jonathan, had some legal claim to the property, but his status was ambiguous. Under Georgia law, legally enslaved, but also Catherine's biological heir. In Westboro, lawyer Talbot tried to sort out the mess, but eventually gave up. Into a kind of legal limbo, the property fell. Within weeks of emancipation, most of the formerly enslaved population left Thornhill Estate. Beyond, they scattered across Georgia and, seeking family members who had been sold away years before, looking for opportunities in cities or simply putting as much distance as possible between themselves and the site of their suffering. At least initially, some stayed. Remained, Hope, helping to organize those who had nowhere else to go. Stayed, Thomas, Eleanor's biological father, who finally, after 16 years, was able to acknowledge his daughter openly. About Catherine, about what had been done to him and to Eleanor, they had one conversation, and then they never spoke of it again. Too deep, the pain was, too tangled with the fundamental wrongness of the entire situation. Herself, Elenina stayed at Thornhill Estate until 1867. In those years after the war, she learned how to exist as a free person, though the psychological damage of her childhood never fully healed. To Savannah, she eventually moved where she worked as a seamstress and married a carpenter named William Foster. Children, she never had. About her mother or her childhood, she never spoke publicly. In 1903, when she died, of Thornhill Estate or Burke County, her obituary made no mention. At the plantation longer, Jonathan stayed, trying to work the land with a small group of freed men who remained. But depressed was the cotton market, exhausted, the soil was, and through the black community in Burke County, the property's reputation had begun to spread. By 1869, Jonathan gave up and abandoned the estate. West, he drifted, eventually settling in Texas under an assumed name. In 1891, he died, and his few possessions included a small notebook where he had written over and over in tiny script. "This, I did not choose. This, I did not choose. This, I did not choose. Rapidly, Thornhill Estate itself decayed. In a suspicious fire in 1871, the main house was partially burned. Into ruin, the remaining structures fell. For unpaid taxes, the land was eventually seized and sold at auction in 1878 to a timber company that cleared the old-growth trees and divided the property into parcels. But in 1871, something was discovered that brought the entire story back to public attention, at least briefly. On a neighboring property, a well driller working accidentally broke through into an old system on what had been Thornhill land. 30 feet below ground, inside the system, was a skeleton. Intact, the remains were mostly preserved by the cool, dry conditions. To a woman, they belonged, probably in her 30s or 40s. From the 1860s, scraps of cloth suggested a dress. Near the skeleton, a corroded metal locket found contained 2 miniature portraits, a man and a young boy. In Westboro, the coroner examined the remains and concluded the woman had died from blunt force trauma to the skull. In an unmarked grave in the county cemetery, the skeleton was buried. As unknown female discovered former Thornhill property, 1871, the official record identified the remains only. But in Burke County's black community, people knew who it was. In kitchens and churches, the story had been passed down in whispers, in coded language that protected those who had been present that night in March 1864. By the people she had enslaved and brutalized, they knew Catherine Thornhill had been killed. In a deep well or system, they knew her body had been hidden. Of a kind, had been done, they knew justice. Over the years, more information emerged, though always fragmentarily, always incompletely. In Alabama, in 1889, a man on his deathbed confessed to a minister that he had helped murder his former mistress in Georgia during the war. No details, he provided no name, but the minister noted the confession in his records. In Savannah, in 1902, a woman, Hope's granddaughter, wrote a short memoir that mentioned the night the devil mistress disappeared and nobody mourned her. In 1923, the most damning evidence came to light when a historian researching Burke County's Civil War history discovered a cache of letters in the courthouse basement. Among them was a letter written in 1865 by Union Captain Samuel Reynolds, who had commanded one of the first federal units to enter Burke County after the war ended. Wrote, Reynolds, at a property called Thornhill Estate, we discovered disturbing evidence, indications of systematic breeding experiments conducted by the late owner upon enslaved persons, including her own biological offspring. In full, the details are too grotesque to relate, but multiple witnesses confirmed that the woman, one Catherine Thornhill, had implemented a program to create a self-perpetuating enslaved population through forced reproduction across generations. What occurred, though they would not explicitly state, the witnesses also informed us that Mrs. Thornhill disappeared in March 1864, and their meaning was clear enough. Further, I have elected not to pursue the matter, as it seems to me that upon this woman, whatever justice was enacted was well deserved. Of what we learned here, I have directed my men to say nothing. Away and forgotten again until a graduate student found it in 1954 while researching her dissertation on Reconstruction in Georgia, the letter was filed. To verify the story, she tried, interviewing elderly residents of Burke County who might remember family stories from that era. Nothing, most claimed to know. One woman, 93 years old, the great-granddaughter of one of the enslaved people at Thornhill Estate, said only, that needed to happen, some things happened. That needed doing, some people did things, and that's all that needs to be said about it. The 23 children found locked in the basement when federal troops arrived, the final mystery of Thornhill Estate concerns. Them, Captain Reynolds's official report mentions, as do several letters written by soldiers in his unit. Freed, the children were emplaced with freedmen's families in Burke County and surrounding areas. After that, but what happened to them is lost to history. To adulthood, some of them surely survived. Of their own, some likely had children, which means there are probably people alive today living in Georgia or elsewhere who carry Catherine Thornhill's genetic legacy without knowing it. From Jonathan or Eleanor or one of the other children from the breeding program, they might be descended. Those distinctive features, pale green eyes, auburn hair, sharp cheekbones that marked Catherine's offspring, they might carry on one of the most calculated systems of exploitation and cruelty in American history. They would never know their ancestor built her legacy. As livestock, they would never know they exist because a woman decided to treat human beings, to build a dynasty on forced reproduction and genetic control. In an unmarked grave in Burke County, they would never know that their great-great-great-grandmother's body lies, placed there by the people she had tormented, people whose names we will never know because they protected each other's secrets even in freedom. Just fields and forest, the site of Thornhill Estate today is no historical marker, the county maintains. In any detail, no books about Burke County history mention the plantation. If you know where to look, the house's foundation is still visible. Of leaf fall and undergrowth, buried under decades. With earth, the old well where Catherine's body was hidden has long since collapsed and filled. But persists, the story, passed down through oral tradition in Burke County's black community, whispered in genealogy circles, referenced obliquely in academic papers about slavery and eugenics. Because it represents something true and terrible about American history, it persists. Not just the brutality of slavery itself, but the ways human beings will rationalize and systematize cruelty when they hold absolute power over others. Something revolutionary, Catherine Thornhill convinced herself she was building, creating a new model for plantation management, securing her family's future. And intensifying one of humanity's greatest evils, in reality, she was perpetuating. And from history as thoroughly as she had tried to erase their humanity, the people she exploited, the people she bred and controlled and tormented, ultimately erased her. Of this story, what do you think? Or are there still secrets buried on that land in Burke County? Do you believe everything was revealed? The full extent of what happened at Thornhill Estate, the truth is, we may never know. To their graves, the people who lived through it, the survivors, chose to carry some secrets. They're right, maybe that's. To the people who endured them, not to historians or storytellers like me, maybe some stories belong. But those people, by remembering that their resistance mattered, that their survival mattered, that they outlasted the system designed to destroy them, we can honor. Moved you, if this story, about the hidden histories in your own community, if it made you think, let me know in the comments below. With someone who appreciates deep dives into America's darkest chapters, share this video. For more stories that challenge what you think you know about history, subscribe to this channel. And remember, as we'd like to believe, the past is never as far behind us. In the next video, see you.